I know it just sounds like a neighborhood prank or something. That's also what I told myself at first, too. Some little snot picking on the old man down the street because he or she feels like they can. But these supposedly inanimate invaders of my humble property are doing unexplainable things. I'm not a superstitious man, but I can't begin to imagine the logistics that would have been involved if this was all some kind of trick. And for what purpose? I don't have enemies. I'm just a regular retiree trying to while away my remaining days in peace, enjoying the relaxing suburban paradise I'd set up for myself. Okay, maybe calling it paradise is a bit hyperbolic, but I really have come to view my nice house outside the city in its nice little neighborhood with my neatly kept lawn and lovingly tended garden as a refuge from the chaotic and ever-changing world outside. I'm always polite, personable with my friendly neighbors. But I'll admit, I'm not much of a social butterfly. I mean, in fact, I've probably spent a significant majority of my time right here within my property lines ever since my lovely wife HIDive passed away a few years ago. I just rarely feel a need to leave unless there's some specific reason to. My somewhat exasperated daughter once even called me the little hermit of suburbia, and was only made more exacerbated when I thanked her for what I mistook as an endearing compliment. Anyway, back to the point. It all started a couple weeks ago. I went out one morning to check on my vegetables, and lo and behold, 3 little garden gnomes were already there, standing guard. I must admit, when coming out to look at my plants for things that shouldn't be there, I was thinking more along the lines of pests, or perhaps a weed or two I'd missed. Not terracotta statues of little bearded men with pointy hats. They're slightly different from each other, but were obviously made in the same style, probably all from the same set, or whatever one calls a gnome collection. Naive as it sounded to even myself now, at first I figured that they were probably a present from some well-being or perhaps a tad eccentric neighbor. As someone who arguably played such a role in their lives of many of the surrounding residents, I took it in stride and left the gnomes in their new posts. The next morning, there were 4. Again, I didn't think much of it, just figured I must have missed one when I was looking around the day before. But then, on the 3rd day, there were 9. They were no longer confined to the garden area. They dotted the front yard in seemingly random places, such as the middle of the lawn, driveways, peeking out from a bush near the front of the house, even one on top of my roof. I almost had a heart attack when I walked out to get the mail, only to open up my mailbox and see a small gnome laid across some letters and bills. At this point, my assumptions went from gift to prank, but I still couldn't come up with any good reason that someone would be doing this, except maybe a warped sense of humor. Inquiries to my neighbors led to only a confusion similar to my own. No one knew, or at least admitted to knowing anything about the gnomes, or haven't seen them being placed. Over the next week or so, the gnomes continued to multiply, and though I'd started removing them and tossing them in the shed before locking it, they'd just be inexplicably back out the next day. I didn't know if whoever had instigated this had made a copy of my keys somehow, or was just good at lockpicking or whatever else, but getting a new lock didn't help, and I soon gave up. I was not willing to, in my mind, escalate this ridiculous battle to the level of finding and installing more secure and expensive lock systems for a rickety old wooden shed to keep the gnomes in, as I'd hesitantly have to explain to questioning onlookers and passerbys. No thank you. I also tried just throwing them out, but as you could probably guess, at this point, that didn't do much. Either the very same ones or identically designed figures would be back the next day, in the exact same spot and position that they were in the day before, along with whichever new little scoundrels had generated overnight. At this point, by the way, from what I could tell, my increasingly interested and concerned neighbors had basically split into 2 roughly equal camps on whether they really were some young tricksters tormenting me in this elaborate farce, for some reason unknowable only to them, or whether my aging mind was finally going to go, degrading to the level of buying and placing lawn ornaments by night, only to forget and panic about the next few figurines that I just put on my lawn by day. Now, none would say this to my face, of course, but the increasing subtext level of my day-to-day conversation began to clearly diverge depending on who I was talking to. My inklings were also supported by a 9-year-old girl named Lucy, who liked to play in her yard next door or wandered into the neighborhood on her bike. She'd always been as friendly as she was blunt, and openly told me to not worry about the little gnomes, you're probably just losing it. Even as her parents believed me and even defended me to other neighbors, I admired her honesty at least. As if things weren't already spiraling out of hand at this point, whatever's haunting me decided to broaden its horizons beyond just gnomes. The first non-gnome to appear was a genuinely cute little frog in a farmer's outfit, caught on a sign that said, "Hippity-hoppity, get off of my property." I became only slightly less baffled once Lucy explained to me that it's from a meme. A part of me felt better at this point, because it seemed to bolster my theory and hope it was just an elaborate teen prank. After all, as I've been informed from the local news I watch every evening, kids are all about the memes these days, and they can lead to some pretty wild and absurd hijinks IRL. So yeah, I'm practically a youth myself. The larger part of me, though, I felt even more at ease. What's sticking with me was how the frog figure was actually on my doorstep facing me rather than facing the street as lawn ornaments usually do, and even as the garden gnomes had been. As they'd been at first, at least, because sure enough, I soon noticed the gnomes, even the original few, had slowly begun to orient away from the street and towards my house itself, bit by bit, day by day. Their smiles and expressions even seemed to grow darker, less jolly, more sinister. Though I chalked this up as likely just anxious imaginings when I first noticed. Once they turned to full-on scowls, or the teeth became pointed. The exact demonic change varied with each figurine. I quickly discarded that notion, though. Suddenly the frog no longer seemed to just be quoting a cute little saying. It seemed like it was warning me off my own property. The house and land these supernatural little lawn ornaments were now claiming as their own. Other fixtures started to appear too, each clearly off in some creepy way right from the beginning. But at this point I was stubborn and determined to not let who or whatever was causing this to get the better of me. Not that I wasn't still scared, I guess that it was just, this all felt so absurd and surreal that my mind was barely even processing it beyond the surface level bafflement and anger. So, for example, when wind chimes appeared that played eerily, discordant notes as they swung in the breeze, whether or not there were actually any breeze at the time, I simply put in headphones when they got too loud or too reminiscent of tormented human wails. The bird bath also appeared, stationed in my backyard. That would fill with foul, acrid-smelling liquid, seemed to collect bird carcasses around the base, as the unfortunate animals apparently didn't notice or care about the abnormal water. They covered it with a tarp to prevent further bird poisoning. When the gnomes themselves started appearing on the outside windowsills, staring into my home with menacing expressions, less than an inch from the glass, I just closed the curtains. The picket fence I had surrounding one side of my house, for when my dog Rusty was still around, even spontaneously developed barbed wire. I mean, have you ever seen a white wooden picket fence with barbed wire on top? It looks at least as ridiculous as it does menacing, though perhaps this entire phenomenon could be described that way. I mean, honestly, I didn't even bother reacting to or trying to fix that one. I believe the tipping point for me finally came yesterday, when I walked outside and the bird bath was suddenly gone. In place of the area it had been standing on, there was a koi pond-style body, some sort of not water. The same that the poisonous bird bath had been filled with. The pond was full of inhabitants as well, not koi, mind you, just slimy, eyeless creatures strongly resembling hagfish. Small animal skeletons were visible from the bottom of the shallow pond. I didn't stoop close enough to the water to tell exactly what kind of animal. You see, now I felt that I knew this was really happening. My yard itself was clearly turning into some supernatural or evil caricature of a happy suburban lawn. It wasn't just some case of a weird, sadistic trickster. Because I don't care how resourceful or clever you are, I don't believe for a second Someone silently and completely excavated a chunk of my yard, filled it with a fresh pond complete with aquatic residence, stone borders, and small walkway, all between the 8 hours when I went to bed and woke up the next morning. I also finally knew that I was clearly not developing some perversely compartmentalized new form of dementia or Alzheimer's or anything, because by this point, I'd taken to photographing my yard every morning and night to keep track of the progress the denizens of my accursed property were making. Sure enough, no pond in sight when I checked the photos of the night before. Also, as sure as I am that no pranksters could realistically install a koi pond overnight, I'm even more positive that I myself couldn't, potential memory issues or no. So I packed up my most important belongings throughout the afternoon. I gave Lucy my phone number to call if the evil lawn spawns did anything different with me no longer home. I know it seems a little shitty to drag a kid into this, but she was more than eager at that point. Most of my adult neighbors would try to have me committed if I asked them at this point, and went to a motel. I briefly considered calling or just showing up to my daughter's about an hour away, but I didn't want to risk whatever's causing this to follow me to her home and possibly endanger her and her kids. Also, motel rooms don't have lawns. Anyway, that was last night, and after hours of nervous insomnia and jumping at every noise or light outside the window, I finally drifted off, probably around 4 a.m. or so, only to wake up this morning with 4 lawn gnomes lined up in my room at the foot of my damn bed. This time, I swear I even heard a faint growl or two as I carried the demonic terracotta figures outside to be dropped off and shattered onto the pavement below. Without even thinking, I shouted something along the lines of, "And stay out, you little bastards!" To the slight bemusement, but surprisingly disinterested look of the woman 2 doors over as she entered her own room. At this point, I'm not entirely sure what to do. Obviously, drastically as it was, just abandoning my house at the invaders isn't enough. And even though I haven't been hurt yet, things are clearly escalating. I was hoping to somehow come across any recording of similar phenomenon. I had no luck. So I'm being proactive. I bet if I'm able to find anyone with some knowledge or useful tips for this kind of situation, it'd be a place like this. Oh, should I also mention I got a call as I was finishing writing up this recount. A few minutes ago, it came from Lucy's mother's phone, with Lucy herself on the line when I picked up. At first, she half-heartedly apologized for calling instead of just walking over to my door and knocking because, quote, "well, duh," as she put it. Before I could ask in puzzlement what she meant, she asked why I'd come back so soon, especially since the gnomes and all were still there. After informing Lucy that I was, in fact, very much not back at my home, she said, "Then where'd the giant basket come from?" Lucy, what basket? The basket of fresh veggies. The note said that you were sorry for your erratic, I'm guessing she was trying to say erratic, behavior. Certainly, recently, here's some fresh vegetables from the garden. Some other thing I forgot, but they probably just weren't worth mentioning. But I was like, wait, you said you weren't going to be back for a while. So I called and after a short pause, I said, "Lucy, I think those vegetables are bad. Do not let you or your parents eat them." She said, "Well, all vegetables are bad, silly." "Lucy, I'm serious. Go throw them away right now. Has anyone eaten any?" I asked fearfully, just imagining what havoc a cursed carrot or two might wreak. "I mean, we haven't. I don't know about everyone else. Looks like every house got a basket," Lucy answered. "Well, I'm leaving now. Heading back to my neighborhood. I got a cab. Since my car wouldn't start at the motel, it just started smoking out of the hood as soon as I turned it on, and when I opened it up to check, there was another damn tiny gnome underneath. Anyway, I can only hope now that I can get to my neighbors door to door to collect the baskets before it's too late. They might get put away or arrested, but I don't care at this point. I mean, who knows what vegetables from a clearly cursed garden are going to do to my poor, mostly innocent neighbors. That's assuming that only vegetables are inside. I'm not sure about this assumption, for the same reason I'm mostly worried about Lucy. When she hung up, it was abrupt. She just stopped mid-sentence. Maybe I imagined it, but I could have sworn the last thing I heard before the line went dead was a soft growl. Same kind of growl I heard this morning. So, let me know of any potential life-saving advice if you can, and wish me luck. We'll see what happens next, I suppose. Sincerely, Eugene. Hello, everyone. I'm updating now that I finally have the opportunity. For those who haven't read my previous post outlining how this all started, see it right there. Now, as I alluded to in my prior comment I made on that post while I was sitting at the police station awaiting questioning, I was in fact taken in for disturbing the peace or some such nonsense upon my return to the neighborhood. During questioning, I told them much of what has been going on, though I deemed it prudent to not quite focus on my primary theory of supernatural causes, and instead just lay out what I knew and didn't know about suggesting the possibility of some elaborate prank by some unknown party. This wasn't as easy as it sounds, as it was hard to explain the weirder things through this lens, especially since they had received statements from a couple of our neighbors outlining what they'd observed of the situation over the past couple weeks. Apparently, fewer and fewer of them find the prankster's theory believable. At one point, I finally lost my patience and blurted out something along the lines of, well, then maybe they're real gnomes, along with a few other possible supernatural theories I had heard from many of you. By the way, to clarify, I was and remain very thankful to you all for those insightful hypotheses, even if the police didn't quite see them as much. Anyway, they deemed a psychiatric evaluation necessary, and I was taken to the nearby hospital for a couple of days. After appearing surprisingly lucid throughout my stay, as I happened to hear one of the doctors say, and being as forthcoming and cooperative as possible, I was eventually deemed of sound mind and let back out to my own devices upon agreeing to and signing a promise to appear in court for the incident. I think the medical professionals I dealt with seemed to be more open to the prank theory and viewed my supernatural musings as the confused ideas of a poor, nerve-wracked and superstitious old man struggling to make sense of a situation he couldn't understand, rather than the full delusions of a raving lunatic. Nothing that would suggest any clear psychological issues or make me a real danger to the public, I suppose. When I arrived home, the gnomes and their various sinister companions awaited me, stationary, staring at me as I drove up. I wasn't sure whether to be concerned or relieved at how little they'd changed since I left. Most of the lawn spawn, as I've decided to use to refer to them collectively, even appeared to be stationed in the same locations. Some were shifted or transported to other parts of the yard, of course, but none in any meaningful pattern that I could discern. Regardless, I slowly and warily made my way to my front door, opened it, and immediately noticed two alarming developments. First is the gnomes had apparently continued multiplying, and really made themselves at home, so to speak. They obviously weren't relegating themselves to the outdoors anymore. Loose objects were strewn across the floor, and various gnomes were distributed throughout my living room, on furniture, tables, random spots on the ground. One was even hanging from the ceiling fan and had the other non-sinister seeming smile of any of the group. Another had taken the place of a table lamp, though he apparently decided kept the lampshade for himself, as it was now placed around the top of his pointy hat, covering the top half of his face. The other more alarming thing I noticed was Lucy. She was standing in the room looking up at a particularly grumpy-looking gnome nestled on top of my bookshelf, before jumping when she noticed me entering the house. Our ensuing conversation basically went like this. "Oh, hey, you're not in jail, that's good," she greeted me. "What? Lucy, what are you doing here?" I asked. "After that gnome fell or jumped on me or whatever, I was really scared for a really long time, like a whole day. That the gnomes were going to come over and attack me again, especially after I killed one of their own. But nothing happened. So I decided to start investigating. Sorry, I thought you were losing your mind at first, by the way." I sighed. I responded that it was okay, and then asked how she got into my house. "Oh, the door was unlocked. Don't know if that was you or the gnomes. When I came in, these guys had already taken over by the looks of it," Lucy responded in a noticeably unfazed tone. "Your parents know you're here?" I asked next. "Of course not," she remarked in a similarly unworried tone. "They think I'm just riding my bike around as usual. I didn't lie to them." She broke in, as I must have looked like I was about to admonish her, and I was. I made sure to ride my bike here instead of walking, so I wasn't being a liar if I didn't have to. Anyway, let me tell you what I found so far, she exclaimed. I didn't stop her. Decided to hold on to my questions and admonishments for now, since I did genuinely want to know what she discovered in her admittedly ill-advised investigation. First thing is, I think the gnomes are in charge. Like, I bet they're behind the other stuff, like the other lawn decorations and the death lake, you know? The gnomes are the only ones that have come inside the house, for example. Also, they don't move when anyone's looking at them. Not even sure they can. When I got attacked, it was from behind. And when I turned to see, he suddenly stopped moving, and I was able to just pick him up and throw him. Since I came here, I've seen them in different places, but never seen them actually move to those places. For safety, though, I've been holding this in front of me as I walk around, she said as she held up a handheld mirror. She really is a clever girl. Anyway, yeah, she continued. They seem to have different jobs, kind of like the ants I've been learning about in science class. Hard to figure out much so far, since I can't watch them while they're doing anything, but the ones outside seem to be like guards. Most of the ones in here are probably workers or some sort, and a few seem to be helpers to the queen. Queen? Oh yeah, maybe I should say king, but I like my art comparison better, so I'm gonna stick with queen. Comparison, I corrected, but she ignored me and went on. Besides, for all we know, some of these guys could be girls. Maybe girl gnomes have beards too. Here, follow me, I'll show you, she said as she walked towards the bedroom. With a sense of dread, I followed her to my bedroom, only to see the bed had been converted into some sort of pillow and blanket fort-looking structure, with a small love seat from my living room placed right in the middle of the bed, adorned with sheets, cloths, and scattered jewelry from my departed wife. Neatly lining the top were a series of bird and squirrel skulls. I briefly wondered how the gnomes had managed to move all this, especially the love seat, before I noticed a series of makeshift rope pulleys that had been installed into the walls and ceiling. A makeshift platform made of my antique dining room table, its cylindrical legs chopped off and placed underneath for that apparent use as rolling logs. On the bizarre throne of fabric and furniture sat an admittedly regal-looking gnome, somewhat larger and more polished-looking than the others. It barely even looked undersized for the chair. As Lucy had alluded to, several gnomes were stationed around the queen like attendants. This ruler of the gnome colony appeared to glare piously toward us in the doorway with a dark and menacing expression on its face, after staring dumbfounded at what had become of what used to be my bedroom. I snapped out of my stupor and turned to the over-curious, under-cautious child next to me. Okay, Lucy. You should not be here. This looks dangerous, even if they can't move while being observed. Go home right now. Lucy opened her mouth as if to protest, but then, to my surprise, she just sighed as if she'd been expecting this. All right, Mr. Eugene, but you have to keep me updated on what happens. That reminds me. See this? She said as she pulled out a walkie-talkie. My parents really don't want me talking to you much anymore, so I borrowed these from my friend Sarah. I tried to put on my best solemn and wise grandfather demeanor, and instead just said, Lucy, do you understand how suspicious it would look if your parents or anyone else discovered you secretly communicating with the old man of questionable sanity that was arrested on your doorstep days before? We could both be in a lot of trouble, mainly me. I thought, but didn't say. Don't worry. I'll only use it with either my parents aren't home or I'm outside. I checked the ranges, though. And you're going to want to keep it to the side of the house, close to mine. Unfortunately, that's the side, obviously. But I'm sure that you'll get used to them, she said, gesturing to the inexplicable collection of garden gnomes that had made a throne room where I sleep. She was already walking towards the front door, even though she hadn't actually given me one. I told her that I couldn't accept one of her walkie-talkies, only for her to tell me which drawer she'd left mine in as she walked out of the house and closed the door. Honestly, after that, I just stood there for a short while, taking in the situation and wondering what I was going to do. Then I realized I'd forgotten something important to ask Lucy, checking to make sure her parents weren't home. Seeing only the car of the older cousin, who often babysat, I said some regretfully vulgar words to myself, grabbed the walkie-talkie from the drawer that Lucy had mentioned, and turned on the device and called Lucy. "Well, well, well," she said with a dramatic triumph a child feels when she feels smarter than an adult. Thankfully, she didn't stretch it out too long. "So soon, Mr. Eugene." "All right, what's up?" "I forgot to ask. Did anything happen with the baskets the other neighbors got?" I hadn't been able to find much out from the police. I did mention it when recounting what Lucy told me, but was afraid to inquire too far since I didn't want them to think that I had tried to poison my neighbors or something. No one ever mentioned them again to me, so I assumed nothing especially horrible had happened, but I wanted to be sure. Lucy answered. "Oh, those? Yeah, I don't think most people even took up or kept theirs, especially after your episode, as Daddy calls it. If they were anything like our basket, the vegetables smelled kind of rotten. I actually took in ours to use them for a prank on my cousin. I think I saw the Harlans throw theirs in the trash outside. Maybe everyone else did too." I could hope that she was right. Still didn't understand how the gnomes and their tools and schemes really worked, but the gnomes that attacked Lucy didn't do so until she brought the basket inside to go through. Who knows? Maybe that gnome was just a one-off thing. So I thanked Lucy, cut off the conversation, still not wanting to use the walkie-talkie any more than necessary. As I turned to put the device back in the drawer, I thought better of it once seeing that most of the gnomes in the room had turned towards me when I wasn't facing them, otherwise hadn't moved. I decided it was probably better not to leave it there, and placed it in my pocket. At this point, I started trying many of you all suggested fixes from the comments and messages that resulted from my prior post. I scattered horseshoes and certain crystals around the house. I burned some sage, incense, and other such herbs suggested to me, and I salted the doorways and the koi pond outside. At this point, the koi pond had grown, as had the hagfish-type creatures inside. Weird, unidentifiable white crustaceans also flitted around the edges. The nearest tree had deformed into a leafless, gnarled mass that leaned over the pond. It's covered with those wailing wind chimes. A little windmill had also popped up next to the pond, but the blades visibly had blood on the edges. I elected not to investigate that particular development much closely. I walked over to my garden, though it was clearly their garden now. None of the plants looked remotely similar to when I'd grown them. The leaves had mostly turned a sickly teal or grayish purple, and leaves were chaotic shapes. The tomatoes were actually even brighter red than before, but apparently fleshier and seemed to faintly beat like a heart. I wondered if the gift baskets had contained vegetables more like these. I poured salt over the plants and surrounding earth, then made my way back to the front door. It was locked. Luckily, I had a key, and it seemed the gnomes and other lawn spawns did not yet wield the power of a locksmith, so I easily opened the door. As I entered, I noticed a new fixture in my living room, a note with the message, "Not welcome," crudely written, and the note pinned to the wall with a large kitchen knife. Every gnome in the room now faced the front door with a scowl on their face. I could see that the salt, horseshoes, and so on had not immediately deterred the invaders. I decided not to push my luck further and heeded their warning, at least temporarily. It looked like I really was going to have to call the professionals. After briefly telling Lucy through the walkie-talkie that I was leaving again, and making her promise absolutely not to investigate the house while I was gone, and tossing out the 20 or so plastic flamingos that just randomly appeared inside my car at some point during all this, I drove to a hotel. I decided on a nicer one this time, closer to my house in case I needed to go back on short notice for any reason. And then I sat down and perused the internet for various religious and supernatural professionals that might be willing to help with my situation. I wanted to cover as much possible ground as possible. So I've already reached out to priests, priestesses of various religions, a psychic or two, even a ghost hunter in my area. I'm even thinking that I might arrange for all of them to come at the same time, though I could use some guidance on whether that's a good idea or not, as well as if there's any kind of professional worth contacting. Either way, I want this handled as soon as feasibly possible because I'm afraid of the increasing spread and power. Especially since As I was leaving the neighborhood this time, I noticed something. A new pair of garden gnomes in the Joneses' yard, clearly styled from the same set. I hope it's not too late for me or them, but I get the feeling that this may all be over sooner rather than later, one way or another. Best wishes, Eugene. Hello, my handful of friends on this community. It's Eugene again. I've come here to share how the situation with the evil lawn spawns developed, and boy, have there been some developments. If you're not caught up, you could use a refresher. My first 2 posts can be found here. Anyway, I want to thank all of you for your kindness and your informative and helpful advice. After reaching out to various individuals who might have knowledge or experience, even tangentially related to whatever's going on with the garden gnomes, invaders, and their minions, I was able to get 3 individuals more cut out for this than me to agree to help me out, and do their best at least. First was a Wiccan priestess by the name of Arabelle, who claimed to have particular experience in dealing with Fae. A somewhat classic hippie type, if I had ever seen one. She was one of the warmest and friendliest personalities I might have ever come across, right up until the subject of Fae comes up, wherein she adopts a very serious and solemn demeanor, with an almost disconcerting speed. If these garden gnomes really are gnomes, then this is exactly the kind of person I needed. I'm also able to procure the assistance of local academics specializing in North European mythology and folklore, through a mutual friend who teaches anthropology at a nearby university. Professor Reynolds seemed to be a gruff, nonsense sort of person from our initial conversations, but also a very deeply informed one, which is what mattered. Now, while the gnome hypothesis seemed perhaps the most likely explanation, I was not willing to rule anything out at this point. When seeking out spiritual leaders or professionals of various faiths and creds, I did relate my story to the priest at the local Catholic church this past Sunday. While I didn't expect much, he was surprisingly open-minded and receptive, and put me in contact with someone from his order, with supernatural experience, so to speak. Think blessing houses claimed as haunted, even assisting in an exorcism or two, while the idea of demonic nature or some other similar dark ritual origins had me actually rooting for them to be just real gnomes again. Not ready to rule anything out at this point. Arabelle and the priest Father Jacob had no issues coming by concurrently, which was a relief to me, as I wasn't sure how many chances I'd get to try whatever methods in order to take back my home if they didn't. Professor Reynolds would agree only to a live video call once there. It would not accompany us in person. She bluntly explained that while she was still somewhat skeptical, she did not want to be there in person if the gnomes turned out to be real, and was sure that she could just as, or at least almost as helpfully, virtually as she could be in person, especially since I already had 2 other people coming along. I believe her particular words were along the lines of, quote, "No need for a 4th person to be put in any real significant danger." When I asked in an alarmed tone if gnomes would really be so dangerous that she was too scared to seize the opportunity to observe one of the major points of her life's research, she simply replied, "Potently," and did not elaborate further. I decided not to push the subject. When the time came, Arabelle and Father Jacob met me at the beginning of the cul-de-sac, where my home is located. Worryingly, they both told me they had noticed a couple of other houses with a couple of almost identical garden gnomes in their yard. After appropriate instructions, I double-checked a short list of things that I might need based on suggestions of Arabelle, Professor Reynolds, and several helpful Redditors. A copy of the deed of the property to demonstrate my true and rightful ownership, a small gift such as a garden implement, some wine, a basket of mushrooms, and a few bags of raw gemstones and crystals, the exact types chosen by Arabelle, not me, brought to give as tokens of relatively goodwill. In my inner jacket pocket, I carried a small mallet, in case of goodwill failed, and items and substances that could be protective against gnomes or whatever supernatural entity these creatures turned out to be. For example, salt, horseshoes, etc. Arabelle gave me silver jewelry and a shawl of some sort covered with glyphs and defensive wards. Father Jacob gave me some holy water and a small Bible. As we then approached my home, I noticed more changes to the yard than there had been in the last time I was there. Much of the grass, even greener than before, but the lawn was straighted with patches of unhealthy, even unnatural colors ranging from grayish blue to sickly yellow-white to what I can only describe as a vibrant dark brown. The shrubbery near my porch had devolved into similar color schemes and are almost unrecognizable. New macabre lawn ornamentation had appeared as well, including hideous stone gargoyles on each side of the door and porch, and lawn flamingos like those that had generated in my car previously, but now with patches of plastic flesh missing to show the skeletons inside, dotted with grass. Even much of the already existing fixtures had progressed to even more twisted versions. The screeching wind chimes that had grown to the size of small organ pipes and appeared ready to cause the branch that they were hanging from to snap at any moment. The picket fence that had spawned barbed wire had also grown. It was now wrapped around the entire front yard, and even the boards themselves appeared to have grown sharp, thorn-like spikes. The hagfish pond in the backyard, meanwhile, had expanded further, now reaching into the side yard. One could even see the edge of some asymmetrical dark gray stone fountain with the cloudy yellowish acid water flowing down the levels, an ominous mist floating above the fluid. Overall, my property now looked like some kind of garish Halloween haunted house attraction, and I hope that no neighbors had been given much trouble by the gnomes if anyone had come to my door complaining about scared children, impact on nearby property values, etc. At that thought, I glanced at the mailbox, thinking to check for angry letters or something, but quickly abandoned this impulse upon seeing a note taped to the door. Warning, huge angry wasp nest inside, scribbled on, most likely from our poor mailman Fred. I sighed and turned back towards the house. After some fumbling with my phone, Arabelle patiently demonstrated for me how to use the FaceTime, and so I called Professor Reynolds to show her the scene. Any remaining skepticism appeared to melt away into concern in her expression as I panned around the yard. A similar change had already occurred moments before on Father Jacob's face. Arabelle, however, had shown no signs of surprise or worry, but looking over the scene with a stoic expression I couldn't quite figure out how to interpret. She spoke first as we started towards the front door. "It looks dark. If these really are earth spirits, they're corrupted somehow. I get the sense that these progressively more eerie installations, and indeed likely even their appearance, are stereotypically terracotta garden gnomes in the first place, could be intentional mockeries or perversions of many standard elements of modern human homes and their surrounding yards." Professor Reynolds continued the line of thought out loud from the smartphone device in my hand. "I think Arabelle is definitely onto something. Many of the ways we portray nature spirits and elementals varies from culture to culture, though analogs are common across many. Perhaps this warped version of classic suburban middle-class home is an inversion of that, so to speak. Them representing themselves to us by warped versions of our own culture tropes. I'm curious to see the inside." Father Jacob just stood quietly, solemnly staring at the door. All he added was, "Whatever they are, they do not appear to be benevolent beings." Then he made the sign of the cross, muttering a quick prayer and opening the door. Inside, an amount of gnomes I can only describe as too damn many, please forgive me the harsh language, were scattered around my living room, standing on furniture and belongings which had been moved to new, somewhat nonsensical locations and or orientations. The ceiling fan now was placed on the wall, somehow still hooked up to the internal wiring, or running on gnome magic, who even knows anymore, as it slowly cycled sideways through the air like some sort of bizarro windmill. Chairs and tables had their legs sawn off, presumably to be lowered to the ground. My couch had been turned upside down and against the wall, creating a small cave-like area that I certainly did not want to go to check further on. Most notably, were the large mushrooms of various shapes and colors that had sprouted from the walls and carpet, as if from the forest floor itself. I sighed again. Without stopping to investigate and infuriate myself further, I turned and walked down the hall towards my bedroom. After a second, I heard Arabelle and Dr. Jacob behind me. "If one of you could walk backwards so as to keep the area behind you in sight," Professor Reynolds reminded us from the comfort of her own non-gnome-infested home. While none of the three people helping me with my situation had a ready explanation for the apparent immobility of the gnomes while being observed, as long as it appeared to hold, we were certainly going to take advantage of it. I reached the door to the master bedroom and heard indecipherable noises on the other side. I hesitated, but then opened the door as the noise immediately ceased as I entered the room. While the changes to the bedroom were milder in comparison to the living room, that was probably because it had already been significantly altered into the makeshift throne room the last time I was there. Our eyes were immediately pulled to the center of my bed, with a love-seat throne stationed on top containing an especially regal but menacing-looking gnome wearing a crown of sorts made of 2 antlers affixed to a rough circle. Where they got the antlers, I have no idea. I might have imagined it, but the king gnome, or queen if you prefer Lucy's no-men culture, even looked bigger than before, now almost as large as a human adult. The room was filled with various workers and attendant gnomes in various positions, some holding random objects from my home of unknown purposes. I tried to make my old meek, shaky voice in a bold pronouncement of sorts, with admittedly minimal success. "This is my home, my property, my house. Quarter or visitation of any sort is neither requested nor freely given. I demand the withdrawal of all beings currently taking residence in this abode, as is my right. However, I want no undue hostility. Whatever circumstances led up to this are in the past, and I humbly ask your forgiveness for any offense unintentionally given to you, just as I'm willing to forget the offense done unto me, whether unintentional or otherwise. Also, we bring gifts as a gesture of our diplomatic desires." I laid down my basket with trembling hands as I said the last part. We'd carefully gone over the verbiage beforehand, and thought that I was nervous about the initial proclamation. Arabelle said I needed to be the one to make the statement to the intruders. Luckily, I was fairly confident I'd gotten a decent portion of it correct. I looked over and saw the clearly uneasy look on Arabelle's face. Hoped it was already there before. After a long, uncertain couple of moments, my proclamation was answered by an eerie, gravelly voice in my head. "Your gifts, meager as they may be, are accepted. Your demands, however, are not." I glanced at my companions to see whether I was the only one to hear the mental voice. I wasn't, judging by their shocked expressions. The voice continued for a few seconds. "Here, which you claim as your own, is rightfully ours. Has been for centuries. Your kind negotiated with us long ago only to curse us, and we demanded our rightful payment for their continued right to coexist with here." I stood there, shocked and unsure of what to say. It was actually Professor Reynolds who spoke up next, quite an unsettling development since it seemed to imply that the voice must have reached into her mind as well, despite her not even being physically here with us. "I believe I can safely say none of us are aware of this curse or prior negotiation. Who of our kind, as you put it, made such a pact and when?" "Humans always forget their sacred oaths. Almost 5 centuries ago, a tribe of humans began to settle on this land, which had been occupied by my clan for millennia. Other groups had come before, but quickly respected our wishes and left upon us, making our presence known, shall we say. This group was different. Besides being different in looks, in custom, in ways obvious even to us, they refused to leave in the face of our warning. After some battle with the encroachers, with casualties on both sides, we agreed to cease fire based on the following pact. we would allow them to remain and occupy the surface. In return, for annual offerings we deal fairly, and the price was not at all unmanageable. 25 barrels of ale, 25 jars of honey, and 50 buckets of certain metal ores such as copper that are not present in this area, but which they clearly had access to from elsewhere, and just one of their offspring. The offspring? As in human children? What would you want them for? I blurted out, afraid of whatever horrible answer I was probably about to hear. Blood sacrifices are a potent source of power, one which my clan is not above utilizing, especially from the young and especially lesser beings like yourself. Again, we only require one a year, yet even that was apparently too much for the greedy humans with whom we had generously shared our land. They soon stopped providing this portion of their payment, and even denying to attempt to make up for it with extra metal. This last sentence was said with increased anger and intensity, and was unbearably loud by the last few words. After a short pause, the mental voice continued, at its original tone and intensity. As was our right, we responded to this brazen breach of the pact by taking 2 young humans the following night. One to meet the original requirement, and another for the attempt to circumvent it. Another voice in my head, higher pitched, but equally guttural, resumed from another gnome, continuing from here. The humans were angry at the disappearance of their young, and demanded to meet to discuss matters. After agreeing to this, we met with a couple of representatives of their village. The humans pathetically pleaded for their children back, and for us to accept any offerings to replace the blood sign. Even though they clearly understood the power of blood magic and the lack of any suitable replacement. We declined, of course. The original voice broke back in. However, in a disastrous moment of inexplicable weakness, my predecessor in leading this clan took pity on the humans and agreed to forgive the attempted avoidance of the most important aspect of their payment by returning one of the children taken. When the time came the following year, the same child had returned and brought forth as the offering, accompanied as usual by adults carrying the other portions of the agreed-upon payment. Notably, however, one of the humans, an older woman that we could not recall seeing among the settlement before, was among the party this time. She carried beside her the sleeping child. A third voice broke in now. As those of us sent to retrieve the offerings watched, the old woman began to recite something in some strange language we did not understand. Before we could enter her mind to make sense of what she was saying, she suddenly pulled out an obsidian knife and stabbed the child in her arm. Now speaking the usual tongue of local humans, she shouted to all who could hear that as both sides had broken the pact the year before, it was their right to nullify the agreement and resume hostilities. The witch, as we could now clearly recognize her to be, then stated that the blood sacrifice of the returned child was to initiate a curse on our clan, as we had taken the child right under the watch of the helpless men and women of the village. We would henceforth be unable to directly act in the presence of, or directly against your kind, or even so much as move, whilst being seen by human eyes. We were forced to retreat further into the earth to avoid even unintentional proximity to your people. We each took a moment to digest this information. Father Jacob eventually spoke up to ask, "What changed then? Why have you targeted this poor man, ignorant of any of what you claim to happen, and innocent of any transgression against your clan?" "No human is innocent," the original gnome's voice boomed in our heads. "Your people's failure to adequately pass on the relevant history is not any concern of ours, and regardless, His home sits directly on the center of our clan's rightful claim. After centuries, the hold of the curse on us is finally starting to fade, and we will not be forced from our home again. This house you call your home, yours, sits on land that was never truly your right to claim, as do all the houses nearby. We may not have been able to successfully infiltrate the others yet, but it is only a matter of time. As the curse weakens and our own power grows, we've already set up agents at several other homes, and we have ways of accelerating the growth of our power further. We strongly suggest that you leave and never come back, and convince as many of your neighbors as you can to follow suit. No mercy will be shown to stragglers. The possible implications of the ways of accelerating comment had gone way over my head, but not Arabelle's. Wait, did you say that one of the gnomes tried to attack the child next door? She asked me. Yes, I said, as the horror of realization settled over me. Wait, you all were going to sacrifice Lucy? I shouted at the gathering gnomes. No voice appeared in my head to confirm or deny my accusation, as the gnomes continued to wordlessly stare at the three of us. Father Jacob pulled out a vial of holy water and swiftly flung it in the nearest gnome. Nothing happened. Damn it, said Father Jacob. This was clearly going nowhere. I then decided to look around again at them, as I wondered what to try next, only to see that garden gnomes now stood all around the three of us, apparently having moved in while we all were paying our attention to the monarch. The inability to move or react while observed gave me another idea. I quickly turned to Arabelle and told her to watch the area behind us as I turned back to face the gnome's leader. Well, no matter who it rightfully or originally belongs to, I want my house back, and will do anything necessary to get it back, I said, trying to sound more intimidating than I'm sure I came off as. We both know you can't move while being seen, which means we both know there's nothing to stop me from walking over there and simply shattering you one by one as my friends here watch my back. I glanced beside me as Father Jacob gave a quick, clear nod of agreement. But to my consternation, Arabelle protested my threat. You can't just slaughter all of them. Vicious as they are sentient beings. That would be mass murder. They want to sacrifice Lucy, and even murder every person in the entire neighborhood if need be, I responded angrily. Better them than us. No, that kind of violent, over-the-top thinking is exactly what caused all of this in the first place. I can't let you slaughter them. I turned to Father Jacob and told him to turn and watch our backs like Arabelle had been, and then turned back and pleaded to Arabelle one last time not to stop me, but a gnome's voice popped in our heads, interrupting my pleas. It's no use. She will not allow you to kill us, and will even stop you if you try. We can see the truth of this in her mind. I turned to her and saw her jaw set firm as she let her silence indicate agreement. And now, friends, I hope you won't judge me too harshly for this next part. But I truly felt it necessary at the time, because once I saw Arabelle wouldn't budge from what she felt she must do, I knew I couldn't either. I'm willing to incapacitate her first, I said to the shock of the silence of everyone present. You can read our minds. Check now and see if I mean what I say. After a few seconds, Father Jacob sighed and said, I will keep watching your back, Eugene, whatever happens. Arabelle said nothing, only staring at me with a cold and defiant gaze. A gnome voice popped in. You won't get all of us, you know. You can't watch every bit of your surroundings indefinitely. All it takes is 1 second where one of you doesn't turn in time with the others, or has its vision obstructed, shall we say. I didn't pause to ponder how the gnomes might obstruct mine or Father Jacob's vision. I just immediately replied, well, I'm still willing to try, and I bet I can definitely kill a lot of you. The gnomes seemed to consider the circumstances for a few seconds before the main gnome voice appeared again in my brain. It appears we are at an impasse. Luckily, we gnomes, as you call us, are more patient than you humans. That, the ground beneath us began to tremble violently. I flew to the ground as the tremors increased, as I started to get the distinct sense of sinking somehow. "What's going on?" Professor Reynolds asked as I dropped the phone. I was wondering myself, but Arabelle answered the question. "I think they're sinking the house. We have to leave now." "But this could be our only chance to stop them," I shouted back. "They're right. You can't get all of them, and if we die down here, who's going to warn your neighbors?" That convinced me. I wasn't even sure how I'd convince all of them to leave. An old man knocking on doors to warn neighbors to leave or get killed in an impending invasion of gnomes didn't sound like an easy sell. But I knew I had to try, in case the gnomes stuck to their guns in this. "All right," I said, and followed her towards the front door as Father Jacob walked behind her, more stumbled backwards, really, after us. We opened the door to see the house already sunken almost a story below ground, with the edges of my imploded lawn looking like a hill during a landslide. The three of us scrambled our way up the ever-steepening hill, not even looking back to see if any of the gnomes followed us. We were able to just make it to the edge of the lawn as the loud rumbling behind us reached a crescendo, and we turned to see my house fall fully below ground. Dirt and earth began to pour into the depression from the sides of the now almost 90-degree walls of the depression at the edge of my property. We could only watch in horror and amazement as the earth swallowed my home, and soon all that was left was a shallow depression of loose earth and upturned dirt that looked like an aftermath of some strange disaster. I looked over across the cul-de-sac, only to see Lucy staring from her bike, mouth agape. She appeared to be the only one that had seen the actual event, though I imagine at least a few other people would soon be coming out of their homes to see what the hell had made that loud noise. Without a word, Arabelle turned and started to walk over to her car. I called after her. "Arabelle, you tried to kill me with a hammer," she interrupted. "Not kill. Incapacitate," I started to respond. "I was only going to knock you unconscious, only for a few minutes, hopefully." I stopped after I saw she already turned back around wordlessly and was already getting into her vehicle. "It'll be all right. She'll get over it, Mr. Eugene," said Lucy as she rode her bike up to me. I wondered at both the sound of her confidence in such a claim, as well as the lack of concern over the accusation of my attempted murder by hammer, but before I could decide whether or not to ask either or both points, she asked the obvious question. "So, what just happened to your house?" I tried to explain as much as comprehensively as I could, but I don't think I was in the clearest state of mind. Certainly was a much less comprehensive account than I would have written here. I do apologize for the delay, by the way, but since this all happened, I've been so busy trying to salvage things. Everyone from the neighbors, to the police, to my insurance company has been reaching out to me, seemingly night and day, to find out what happened. And what do I even tell them? Any photo evidence of proof of the truth would have been buried with my smartphone device after I'd dropped it in the house. But I can't think of a remotely believable, sanitized, or even false but believable version of events. So I mainly just stick to pretending I have no idea what happened, just being as baffled as those who ask me. Professor Reynolds is pretending to have no participation in the events, and I haven't really pushed hard against because, honestly, I don't blame her. Arabelle refuses or ignores any attempt at contact, which also seems fair enough. Father Jacob has extended his support to me and made it clear to reach out to him if I need anything, and that he'll vouch for me as need. I don't think he'll take him up on that for some reason. I moved to an extended stay hotel rather than accept my daughter's offer to move in with her and her husband for a bit. That reason is I don't want to get anyone involved in what happens next if they don't have to be. You see, my friends, I can't shake everything the gnomes told me and pretend that because my house is gone, that they are too. Even after I saw that the scattered gnomes in my yard, the agents, as they are referred to by the king, had all disappeared shortly after the implosion of my property. Because I know it might all be too temporary. Just before the gnomes began to sink my house into the earth, one of the gnomes had said that gnomes are more patient than you humans. I don't think they've given up on the plans at local domination. I just put them on pause. And probably a relatively short one at that. I'm not going to sit around and do nothing while I wait for that to happen. Better for my neighbors to lose their homes and their lives. So I've been researching my options for forcing a relatively permanent evacuation of my neighborhood. Toxic waste I can produce from the dark web, and bombs, carefully targeting arson, those kinds of things. I wouldn't share exactly what I settled on, but so as not to unnecessarily implicate myself any further than I already have. As such, it's probably just going to be my last update, since any advice I might need likely be better suited for a different forum, so to speak. But I do want you all to know how much of help you all have been to this poor old man, because at his wit's end. Without you all, who knows what would have happened. I might have been institutionalized or abandoned my home to never return and just let the garden gnomes kill everyone in the neighborhood. Instead, I had faced the invaders, and now I'm ready to do what still needs to be done. No matter the consequences. Warmest regards. Eugene. Hey there kids, it's me, MrCreepyPasta, and I want to tell you thank you so much for watching tonight's video or listening to tonight's episode of the podcast. I really appreciate it, and anytime you guys give me a subscribe or a follow or a like or a comment or literally just a watch, I can't thank you enough for it, because you're the reason I keep making episodes, and you guys are the reason that I love horror as much as I do. It's the middle of summer, and I'm sure you guys have summer reading lists or something like that, but wouldn't it be cooler if I just read to you? So, you can always check me out on Audible, audible.com. You can search up MrCreepyPasta, and I have a whole bunch of books that I've done audiobooks for there, such as Tales from the Gas Station, or the very newest one that I've done, Pastel-Colored Dreams and Human-Flavored Nightmares by Vincent Venicava. If you haven't checked that out yet, hot dang, you should. And as always, I want to give a very special thanks to all of my patrons at patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta, because you guys are the reasons I get to keep my lights on in the house and get wonderful little treats for my cats and everything like that. And also the reason why we keep getting special custom series just for the channel. So a special thanks to Jacob Shaffer, Jordan Alexander Sanchez, Bryon Arce, Ken Lando Higuchi, Bobby Karman, Tristain Pelton, Chase Burnett, Bardo Hawk 764, TheBananaMafia 1, Melancholy Corpse, Hollow Zero, Ferb, Harley, Billy Morrow, Katie Birch, Sashi Sazaku, Kayden the Spooky Boy, MyBodySoundsLikeRiceKrispys, AshWood, Lord of the Weebs, Jay, Feyelocket, Miss Xandra, MrUnsettlingSpaghetti, Eurogore, Suji Campbell, Marco Takes Dabs 420, Stricken, Ozarine Fox, Robert White, Andres Garcia, Snails Brennan, Legit Quad Feed, James Bruce, Chris Lovins, Freddy Krueger, Tynan, Justin Johnson, Michael Scarborough, Infernal One, James Lowe, Lisa Cottrell, Caspian, Jordan Els, Hades Nephew, Tater Chip, Acid System, Prozac and Pancake Appreciation Society, Cryptic Nightmares, Someone You Love, Kiri the Sloth, Tommy Green, Sky Harbor, Caleb Dougal, Nina Smith, Nico Kayo, Rafael Rodriguez, The Ginger Bros, Aaron Stormcrow, Daniel Polson, Trace Miles, Corey Kenshin, and Peaceful Buddha. That's right guys, at patreon.com/MrCreepyPasta, you could join this amazing list of people's names I mispronounce, and the list of Patreons down there in the description. But of course, none of that is ever required. I just appreciate you guys subscribing and watching and honestly being here. So all of you, sweet dreams.